Welcome back to Edwin Eisendrath's It's the Democracy, Stupid on WCPT 820.
I am joined by Dana Strohl. I cannot tell you how grateful I am. She directs research at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. She previously served all of America as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Defense for the Middle East. That's important. That's the Pentagon's highest civilian official for that complicated part of the world. And she's worked on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, so she knows American foreign and military policy at its core. And she knows it in this volatile, frightening, entirely messed up part of the world. So, Dana, thank you. Really a pleasure to talk to you.
Pleasure to be with you.
Before we start on the Iran war, which I think is what I want to spend most of my time with you on, I think we have to talk to everybody about the landscape over there pre-October 7th. What that looked like, where, and what has happened to the Iranian proxies since. So that sort of sets the table, I think, in a way that will make sense for people.
Sure. Well, thanks for having me on. And I think talking about the pre-October 7th Middle East, it's important to remember what actually the Obama administration, the Trump administration, and the Biden administration had attempted to do, which was wind down these big, sometimes people call them forever wars in the Middle East, in Iraq
Mhm.
and Afghanistan, right size US posture, military investments in the Middle East, but there was also a view that the real challenges to US leadership and US national security came from the Asia Pacific theater from China. And so part of how we thought about protecting US interests was reducing some of those military investments in the Middle East. We've been so focused on countering terrorism, fighting Al Qaeda and ISIS in the Middle East, and really thinking about how to transition the bulk of our military investments and commitments to another theater. And also, I think the pre October 7th landscape important to remember is that during the Biden administration, Russia invaded Ukraine. And so there was a lot of focus, a lot of national security focus, not on China and the Asia Pacific theater, not on Iran and the Middle East, but actually on shoring up US investments and commitments to our allies in the European theater and countering Russian unprovoked aggression against Ukraine. So the landscape of the Middle East before October 7th was thinking through right sizing US military commitments and investments in the Middle East, but there were also the Abraham Accords. There was the beginning of this idea that Israel was beginning to integrate and normalize with the rest of the Arab world. There was a lot of military integration and cooperation that was going on. And so, generally, the focus in the Middle East was on not increasing US military investments, but really transitioning to these longer term security and strategic commitments beyond the security file.
Okay, that's not what I was expecting, but because that is so at odds with where we are. So we have a world where legitimate, ongoing, growing challenges in the Asia Pacific region that we have a national security interest in addressing, a new challenge in Europe, which we have a national security interest in addressing, and a present reality where we've taken from both of those theaters to put back in the Middle East for reasons yet unknown.
Yes, and I think so October 7th and the Hamas terrorist attack on Israel was this reckoning both with assumptions about how Iran and its network of terrorists and proxies and non-state actors were calculating their own interests in the Middle East.
Yes.
And what I think is really important about that post October 7th period are two things. One is that from a military perspective, despite what I just said about really trying to focus on the Asia Pacific theater and on the European theater, What Biden did was plus up the military posture in the Middle East. He sends 2 aircraft carriers to the Middle East,
Right.
much more air defense, really does all of these things to support Israel's ability at the time to defend itself. And the real concern at that moment, immediately after October 7th, was that Iran would activate all of its terrorists and proxies across the Middle East. So not just Hamas, but Hezbollah in Lebanon, proxies in Syria, the Houthis, an Iran backed partner in Yemen, and then that even Iran itself could directly attack Israel. And so the emphasis from the post October 7th period was both protecting U.S. investments and our own forces who were deployed across the Middle East, but
Mhm.
also supporting Israel's ability to defend itself.
Yeah, I mean, Joe Biden went there. He sent more forces there and at Carrier Group, and he said, "I have a message for those who would take advantage of this situation. Don't." I remember that. Um, but he also encouraged Israel not to make some of the same mistakes the United States made after 9/11, and they didn't listen to him either. So nobody listened to him.
Well, I think there's the part of the story of the post October 7th period is that Israel was able to defend itself and go on the offensive against threats that before we didn't really contemplate using military force in this way. Both Hamas in Gaza, Hezbollah in Lebanon, and then prior to the current war of 2026, remember Iran attacked Israel in April 24, in October 24, and then last summer in 25, there was the 12-day war. And in each of these cases, Israel defended itself. And at times, there was even an international air defense coalition to support
Right.
Israel in those efforts. But all of Israel's ability to take on these different threats very much relied upon that increased U.S. military investment and commitment and resources that Biden sent to the region and then Trump in his second administration continued.
Yep. So the proxies have been weakened. Um, that means that Iran's calculations, just forever, Iran knew that if there was um, a military engagement, it was going to happen um, on the borders of Israel. It was going to happen with its proxies. Now, with they're so weakened, it's happening in Iran. And that's probably not what they had in mind. Um, but at the same time, Israel's response to October 7th has cost them the support of millions and millions of Americans. And it's hard to know because it's a very tough neighborhood to get truth out of. Um, but they're very credible arguments of war crimes have been committed by the IDF, and we don't have an ability to adjudicate that yet because it's still ongoing. So, I don't know in the long term whether Israel's security is better or worse because of this. Certainly, their moral authority is not what it was, and I think maybe irreparable. We'll see.
Well, I think there's so much to unpack in what you just said, and so I'm gonna try to take a few different elements of it and respond.
Yep.
The first is that when when we talk about the threat from Iran, this is a radical regime whose core interest is in surviving, right? And extraction from the Iranian people. And the way the regime, since the founding of the Islamic Republic, has attempted to ensure its own survival is by investing in strategies to keep the war away from Iran. So that was the proxy network, Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis, at one point Bashar al Assad, the ruler of Syria. And then it was the ballistic missile arsenal, and then more recently, the drone
Mhm.
arsenal. The idea that don't contemplate attacking us because we can unleash complete havoc across the Middle East, targeting
Yep.
not only Israel and the tens of thousands of U.S. forces, young men and women deployed across the Middle East, but also could target civilian infrastructure, energy infrastructure, all the things that we've just seen. And the third pillar of what the Iranian regime used to ensure its own survival was the nuclear program. And
Yes.
of course, this has been a shared interest of the United States, basically the entire
The
world, the
entire world.
Europeans,
Yep.
Russia, and China at one point
Yep.
to prevent Iran from crossing that nuclear threshold and obtaining a nuclear weapon capability. What is, I think, different about the post October 7th landscape is that Israel took on Hamas and attempted to degrade and collapse the organization. Then it took on Hezbollah.
Hmm.
Then it took on the Iran proxy network inside Syria that had
Yeah.
thrived under the very welcoming umbrella of Bashar al-Assad. It also took on the Houthis, and then, after being attacked by Iran, responded in April 24, October 24, and then finally last summer in the 12-day war. Um, so I think it's important just to recall that for a long time, the world has been rather aligned on the threats coming from Iran. And
And
what
we still
we
are,
never did,
largely.
I think, there's so much focus on the current state of what did we actually achieve in this current war that was very much led by the United States. Just to be clear, this was a Trump decision to get into the current war. That we are losing focus on what the ultimate objectives here are,
Well,
and
let me
the
back up.
ultimate.
I agree with you
Sure.
about that. Just, I love your three-part, this is what Iran did to protect the regime that's in power. Very clear. But I wanna ask one question about that and put myself in Iran's shoes. Um, I spent a lot of time in that part of the world, and the Sunni Shia conflict overhangs almost everything, maybe bigger even than the Arab-Persian conflict. Um, and from Iran's perspective, they're th they would say, "Look, we needed these proxies because the Shia populations in all of these countries were under, enormous stress and danger from the Sunni majority." That was true all around, and that was what they were doing. I don't believe it, but that's a at least from if you put yourself in their shoes, which I think you have to do to negotiate with anybody, that's at least part of what they were afraid of, and not without completely without basis.
Yeah, so I'd rather look at the fact pattern rather than trying to put myself in Iran's shoes here. I think the bottom line here is that the
That's why you
regime
did what you did and did it well.
right. So look, the regime in Tehran is a kleptocratic regime
Yes,
that has ensured its own survival at the expense of the Iranian people.
every day,
Every day,
every day.
including in January, perpetrating the worst massacre against the Iranian people who would like some very basic freedoms, the opportunity to have a stable currency, to keep the lights on, to have jobs, to not be forced to dress the way the regime tells them to dress, to express their views in media, to have access to the internet, very basic
Yeah,
things.
water
And
security. Yes.
basically, there's not a Sunni majority in all of these countries. I think it's much more complex and rich ethnic, religious,
Mhm.
sectarian fabric in Lebanon, in Syria, in Iraq, in Yemen, etc. And generally, what Iran has done is weaken central governments, cultivate and foment its own interpretation, a radical interpretation of Islam, of
Yes.
Shia Islam. um, it has armed sub-state actors that do not respond to the will of the people. It has taken on targeted assassinations of people who dare to speak up against what they think is malign, nefarious Iranian influence. So I think that whatever the regime might say publicly, and for certain Tehran has been extremely effective in the propaganda war, we need to call out what this is. And at the end, what follows Iranian influence across the Middle East is corruption, human rights abuses, armed sub-state actors that undermine the authority of these states, and generally lead to more instability, trafficking of weapons, trafficking of drugs, etc. It
Yeah.
hasn't been good for the Middle East.
Yeah, I think there is, in the United States, bipartisan and around the world, global understanding that Iran is a bad actor, both for its government, for its own people, and around the region. And for those of you listening, for a while I worked in Beirut, and if you wanted to go from one side of the town to the other, sometimes you had to cross Hezbollah checkpoints. The government does not control the country. It doesn't have sovereignty over that nation. So it's a very complicated mess.
Now, all of that being said, even if there's alignment on the problematic policies and strategies coming from Tehran, I think there's a different discussion on the wisdom and the objectives of the current war that has just been waged
Right.
and what the end goals are. And getting back to something we were talking about before, which is the way in which these different Iran supported and backed actors have been degraded since October 7th, there is without question, I think, a real struggle by the United States and Israel right now to transition from military operations to however you would sustainably leave the region in a better place. And
Mhm.
what we know from the wars that have already been fought in the Middle East and anywhere else is that nothing ends with military instruments alone, that there has to be a political process, that there has to be civilian led vision, that there has to be diplomacy. And that I think is the real inflection point we're at now in the Middle East, which is an inability to actually define a political process, get stakeholder buy in, and put other tools on the table other than military force.
Yeah, well, both, Bibi Netanyahu and Donald Trump confuse a target list with a strategy, but that is a real problem. 10 minutes before we launched this latest war, there was an enormous opportunity. I mean, you had all of those proxies weakened, and you can argue everybody will that the way they were weakened was inhumane, but they were leave that aside just for this moment. They were much they were badly weakened. There was turmoil inside Iran. The leadership of Iran was ancient, and we had deployed military around to increase the pressure before Iran knew what that military could do and might not be able to do. So we were in the best position to negotiate a different kind of a future in that region than I think we'd been in years. And we didn't have the patience or the strategy or the guts to do that, and we blew that opportunity. That's my view, but I'd like yours.
There's a lot of speculation about what happened in those talks as the military buildup was happening in the
Mhm.
Middle. And I think one of the most plausible theories is that this is an administration who does not appreciate history, does not value outside expert advice, and has certainly not relied upon the wealth of technical, historical, and diplomatic experience that they have in our State Department in the United States, in the intelligence community, etc. And so what happened in those talks, the President Trump has empowered the same people really to lead almost every single major file on the national security agenda for the Middle East, for the world, whether it's Russia, Ukraine, Gaza, Iran, etc. And all of those are his son-in-law Jared Kushner and one of his personal friends Steve Witkoff. And by all accounts, in the rounds of negotiations that Witkoff and Kushner led, they didn't bring with them a bench of technical expertise and diplomats. And I think when it comes to previous nuclear agreements that were arranged with Iran, it took years to get those agreements. And we brought technical experts, non-proliferation experts, intelligence professionals from our Department of Energy, from our CIA, from our State Department. And none of those people were present during these negotiations. So, was there a missed opportunity? I think it's fair to say that had we put in more effort, we might have been able to make a better case. Either that the Iranian regime was completely in transition and unwilling to make concessions, or at least proven to the world that we were willing to give diplomacy a chance. And because those things did not happen, the United States has found itself extremely isolated internationally as it waged this war. And most Americans don't understand it and don't support, and the polling really backs that up.
Oh, you mean it's not okay for the president to give a lengthy State of the Union message and not tell Americans that there's a credible threat against us, so credible that he thinks we should go to war the next week and not mention it once? Yeah, that really, or not tell any of our allies or partners that we are going to effectively shut off their power supply, their oil for the foreseeable future. Yeah, America's never been this alone.
I mean, not only that, it appears that the Trump administration didn't even notify the dependent families of our deployed forces across the Middle East, our diplomats and our diplomatic families. Embassies weren't given a heads up. Embassies didn't send any warnings to either to American citizens that were in the Middle East or to our own families who are serving in these countries. So, no, we didn't really take care of our own people in the Middle East. We certainly didn't take care of our allies and partners. and especially not only Israel, but when it comes to our partners in the Gulf and Jordan, these are partners that have stood by us, host U.S. military bases, host U.S. forces, and they weren't given a heads up either. And they've really taken the brunt of Iran's retaliation. The United States should and must do better by our allies and partners.
Well, this is not, this is an extreme example, but I was in Riyadh when Barack Obama said there is a red line in Syria. And if Hafiz Assad uses gas against his people, we will retaliate. And then Barack went to the podium and said, "Oops, I've changed my mind." And my Saudi friends looked at me and said, "We will never trust the United States ever again." Now they did. They got over it and they trusted Donald Trump because they felt a kindred spirit with him. But I'm not sure they will ever trust the United States ever again. And then that's not just the Saudis, but around that region, we have proven to be a very difficult friend.
I agree with you. I think if you are a government in the Middle East and you look at the big swings in U.S. policy, and we can go much further back
Yeah.
than President Barack Obama,
Yeah.
there are big swings in American foreign policy in the Middle East based on who is in the White House, and that lack of predictability is very hard in the Middle East. And I think it's also important to remember from a governance perspective there's only one democracy in the Middle East. So the monarchs of the Middle East, when they look at US foreign policy, they are thinking in generations, and we are thinking in 2 to 4 year terms. And that mismatch of priorities and a greater sensitivity, I think, to public opinion in the United States because of our electoral cycle makes it very hard. I think it's not only a question of our Arab partners in the Middle East. Look at Europe. I mean, we are in this administration, questioning things like our commitment to the NATO alliance. So yes, I agree with you. I think this very much diminishes the confidence of our allies and partners in the United States, and what has always been our value added, our strategic asset that nobody else has is that unmatched network of alliances and partnerships, which has enabled us to do all sorts of things for decades.
I don't understand how that can be because, and well, yes, I do, but I want to ask you if where the failure is because uh, the strategic interest of America, in the world do not change every 2 years. That's just not that it doesn't happen that fast. Our politics may change, but the strategic interests of the United States are it's a big ship to turn, and those interests don't change every couple of years. So how is it that policy has become so disconnected from the strategic reality in very important places on this planet?
Well, we could spend hours and read books about this issue. I think a few things. One is at a very broad level, we are still living in a post COVID, post pandemic world, and the information environment has completely changed. So, what
Hence, you and
America,
I are speaking on Substack rather than ABC News because a lot of the public now is or CBS News, a lot of the public is like, "Wait a minute, what?" Right, a whole different information ecosystem has happened.
I think it's not only a
Good and ill.
information ecosystem, it's a choose your own adventure information story. So, based on your worldview, what you choose to listen to, what you choose to
Yep,
watch, what you choose to consume, where you get your information is so localized and so tailored. And so that's number one. Number
yes.
two is I think our leaders generally don't do a great job talking to the American people about what we gain from a rules based international system in which the United States is a leader and what it means to work with allies and partners. And what that means is that we don't always get our way first all the time. It is that what is good for us is also good for others. And what we've seen, I think, especially with the current administration, is this very narrow focus America first, transactionalism. If you are gaining something that's bad for me in a zero sum game. And I think a lot of Americans are misinformed about what U.S. assistance does, what U.S. military investments abroad do and deliver for American security.
Mhm.
And, so I think going forward, we have an information issue, we have a basic education issue. Americans need to do better at understanding our role in the world and how resilient economically prosperous global ecosystem actually is good for
For
America.
us, has been, yeah. Wow. Alright, let me go back to, this current conflict. Um, I mean, I think that we were emboldened to attack this time, not just because we sent, children to do adults' work in negotiating, but because Iran was weaker. Having the proxies gone, we can attack a country that's weaker, not because it's stronger. I think we attacked them because they were less of a threat, not because they were more of a threat. But did this attack weaken the regime further, or do you think it has strengthened the regime inside Iran?
So, at a conventional level,
Yes.
I think we've weakened the Iranian regime. So, in terms of what the military campaign attempted to accomplish, let's set aside the mixed messaging at the presidential level.
So you're not
Our
talking about strategically, you're talking about tactically,
I'm talking
right?
operationally.
Yes.
Our
We blew up a
military
lot of stuff.
100%. Our military leaders have been very consistent in what they were seeking to do with military means.
Yes.
Set back the nuclear program.
Yes.
Set back or neutralize not only the missile arsenal and the missile launchers and the drone arsenal and the drone launchers, but also Iran's military industrial complex to keep building more drones and missiles, also the Iranian Navy. And then we did have the United States working in a unprecedentedly combined manner with Israel, and Israel took on other targets, very specifically decapitating the top civilian and military leaders of the Iranian regime. So all of this taken together, I think you can look at it and the estimates are that we destroyed 80 to 90% of their conventional weapons arsenal. So we've set back these threats for years. The challenge is how the Iranians responded, and that's largely asymmetric. They did not seek to match us missile for missile, airstrike for airstrike. They didn't have an air force. That's not how they responded.
Pause
What
there
they
for 1 second. You were in those rooms. Was there 1 second where where people did not expect them to respond asymmetrically? Was there 1 second where people didn't say, "Yeah, you know what? They don't have the conventional forces we have. They're gonna do something different?"
No, I think when it comes to this, and just to be clear here, I've served under 4 secretaries of defense and I've seen 3 presidential administrations, and I also looked at this issue set when I was in Congress, and I believe in terms of US leadership and upholding and backing up US commitments,
Mhm.
we always said that there was a credible military option on the table should diplomacy fail.
Yes.
The risks of what a conflict with Iran looked like made it incredibly important that you exhaust every possible outcome diplomatically and a political resolution to this because of the understanding that Iran would respond asymmetrically, its proxy network that had developed across the Middle East, its missile arsenal, its drone arsenal, and the fact that we've seen Iran respond before when it has been under pressure by threatening freedom of navigation, not
Which
only in the Strait of
geography
Hormuz.
is in their favor on this.
Absolutely, and we've seen them play these cards before.
Yeah, yeah. So
So,
you saw
no, I think it was, absolutely predictable that the Iranians would respond by escalating quickly and asymmetrically and seeking to impose political and economic pressure in response to our military pressure.
yeah. Okay. So this is part of your answer that we were the question was, have we strengthened or weakened the regime in Iran with this action? You said conventionally we've weakened them, and that was a military answer. Are they more likely to fall than they were, or are they more likely retrenched? They have now a younger generation. They have so we missed the opportunity to get them at the when the old man dies. Um, w- uh, what about unconventional? What about the rest of the answer?
So, first of all, what's clear is that this campaign did not collapse the regime. If anything, what it facilitated is a more hardline, more militaristic regime in Tehran. Whereas before, at least you had a supreme leader, and I don't want to defend this guy, but he played a balancing role between the different power centers in Iran.
Hmm. Hmm.
Now, what's quite clear, I think, is that the IRGC is calling the shots in Tehran, and the IRGC has been the part of the Iranian regime charged with ensuring the survival of
Of
the
the regime.
Islamic Republic.
Yeah.
So these guys are unlikely to make the grand bargain that would be in the US interest on the nuclear file, on the missile file, on the support for terrorism, all of these things. And then beyond the fact that, it's going to be harder to negotiate with a post-war traumatized but surviving regime, is that they discovered a 4th card to play in their response, and that 4th card is freedom of navigation in the Strait of Hormuz.
Mhm.
And what they have learned is that they can bring the global economy close to a standstill. The pressure, especially in Asian countries and next European countries, is so intense right now. And for the Gulf countries, they really depend on being able to export goods, not only oil products, but others through the Strait of Hormuz.
Fertilizers, yeah.
Fertilizers, helium, we can go on and on.
Yeah.
So, Iran is not blocking the Strait of Hormuz with a conventional navy. They're doing it with the risk of one fast boat, one suicide boat, an anti-ship ballistic missile fired from some fast craft.
Yep.
And so this asymmetric threat and the fact that insurers and shippers are not going to try to transit the Strait of Hormuz and people do not have confidence that the US military can ensure them on safe transit is a major strategic challenge for the United States right now.
Yeah, and one that we didn't have a month ago, or 2 months ago. Wow. Okay, that's a 50-50 question on whether the regime is stronger or weaker. It depends
I
on where you look, that's the answer.
I think it depends, and I think it's the timeline. You have to consider the timeline. So at this moment in time, it's not stronger conventionally, it's not stronger economically, and if this war ends, the problems that plagued the weakened regime before that brought protesters out to the street
Are still
remain
there.
and are gonna get
Bigger,
worse.
and they're bigger. Yeah, yeah. Um, we've also heard a lot of talk, and I just don't again, there's no way the public can know the truth because everybody seems to be lying. Have we dangerously, reduced our own stockpiles of weapons? I mean, this conversation has gone on a lot. So people said, "Well, we also have degraded our own capability dramatically, and in a way that will take years and years and years to it, and more money than is imaginable to undo." What's the status of that?
So, in terms of the objective numbers of our stockpiles, those are classified and for good reason. So, we're
Yeah,
never gonna know. But I
right.
think it's important to pay attention to the trend lines. And the trend lines before this war were worrying. There was an active debate about the American defense industrial base not being able to produce either munitions or missile interceptors fast enough. And the US military was taking from its own stocks for both Ukraine and Israel well before this war in 2026. And
Mhm.
I think it's also important to pay attention to the reporting from last year, 2025, during the 12-day war, that the United States used a significant amount of its missile interceptors to support Israel's defense when Iran's retaliation was only aimed at Israel and not the rest of the
But
Gulf.
not the rest of the Gulf.
And so now what we're gonna have a challenge with when you listen to the numbers, CENTCOM, US Central Command, our military that executed this war, has been very public in reporting the number of strikes, the number of sorties, the kinds of munitions that they used in their offensive campaign. And when you add those numbers up, and then you look at this big $1.5 trillion defense budget request that the Trump administration just debuted, and then you listen to the debate that happened recently with Secretary of War Hegseth in Congress, we're probably only scratching the surface of how many munitions we used, both offensively and our missile interceptors to defend against Iran's retaliation. And it's not just the US military that we need to replenish. We also have a lot of partners and allies that buy from us. And
Mhm.
they've been really busy defending themselves in the Middle East and in Europe. So this is a really big piece of business. There's a lot of focus on whether defense industry can move fast enough, but the bottom line is it's going to take years to replenish.
So does that mean that we are at greater risk in Asia of Chinese mischief? Ukraine is its own uh, different case. They've learned to live without us, and that is a different issue for America. But
Well, first of all, I think that if there were to be a war in the Asia Pacific theater, it's not going to look exactly like this one. So it's not an
right.
apples to apples, the kinds of munitions, the kind of defense, those sorts of things. Number two is, I think there's clearly active consideration in Beijing about how they best secure their interests. And of course, there's this big summit coming up with Trump in a couple weeks in May. But I think that they are certainly looking at the experience of what they just saw the US and Israel attempt to do in Iran and absorbing lessons learned for what it means for potential war in the Pacific theater.
Hmm. Yeah. Not that it matters, but if I were China, I would let us continue to be self-destructive, and we're only damaging ourselves.
There's
Um,
been some very good public reports from the US intelligence community for years now that talk about what China is seeking to do, which is to remake the existing US led international order in a way that is more conducive to Chinese interests. And so I agree with you. If you're China and you're looking at the ways in which the United States is eroding our alliances and partnerships, actively bringing questions into whether or not we're going to stand up for these long held values and principles that we've upheld really since the post World War II and then post Cold War international order, I'd agree with you. I think they probably have more to gain from just watching us self destruct.
Yeah, I mean, we thought for a while China didn't believe in this order, that they were trying to evade it at all costs, and that we were imposing an international set of rules and laws and the institutions that support it. And now China's figured out that chaos isn't good for them either, and that since we're abandoning those, or they're betting that we will not descend into an imperial world, but that they can step into our place, leading a rules-based world.
And they're actively messaging as such. They're
Yep.
actively saying clearly you can't rely on the United States. They didn't look out for you. They didn't give you advanced warning of this. You're much better off working with us.
Oh, there all right, so there are some other things that have happened during this war that are interesting. I don't know where to place them. Maybe hopeful, maybe at least setting the groundwork for hopeful. For instance, I think I read that, Israel sent Iron Dome, uh, 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 capabilities to the UAE, and the UAE said to the IDF, "You can come and man them." That's different, at least.
It's absolutely different. It's quite significant. So, a
Yeah.
few things here. What is, I think, really unique about this is that when the news came out that Israel sent not just Iron Dome, but Iron Beam, so this laser that can
Yeah.
help
Yeah.
intercept the short range missiles and the drones, the UAE stood up and affirmed it and said, "Yes, this is a friend and a partner we had a need, and they were there for us in our hour of need." Um, and if to think about a pre-Abraham Accords environment where any Arab would have said, yes, we actively welcomed Israeli forces on the ground, boots on the ground in our country was unthinkable.
Unthinkable,
So
but
I do think that Israeli technology, defense technology, and what they've done with their really unprecedented layered air defensive system to defend against Iranian attacks. If you look at the rest of the region, you have to be thinking at this point, what is Israel willing to share with me so that I can better protect my own infrastructure and
yeah.
people?
Yep, yep. And I also look at this and I'm like, China, Russia, they have nothing here, that's really impacted this. They're involved, they're helping, but they haven't. It feels like Turkey, maybe Qatar, maybe the UAE, are these sort of middling powers, are showing that they have a stronger hand than the ones we thought were the real powers, and that also has some interesting implications for the future.
Well, first of all, I think we are only beginning to understand what a post Iran Middle East order might look like. And there is this theme of middle powers in the Middle East stepping up and mediating, whether it's Turkey and Qatar
Yep.
in the Gaza Hamas situation, Oman, then Qatar, then Turkey, and now Pakistan in the US Iran situation. There's been all sorts of interesting alignments related to other issues. Um, And then, only in the past week, we've seen, I think, this resurfacing of UAE Saudi rivalry. So
I wanted to talk about that too. Yeah.
one might think that after the experience of these Iranian attacks, you'd see more emphasis on unity and collective defense in the Middle East. And at least right now, that's actually not what's happening. I also think in the coming weeks and months, we're going to find out more about ways in which military and intelligence cooperation likely deepened with Israel and the United States, even if the public mood music was not very supportive of this war.
So let me just be sure I understand this, because the coalition of countries over there has stayed together in part because of the perceived Iran threat for a long time. So now there's a there's a strengthening military tie between those nations and the United States and Israel, but maybe not between the Arab nations themselves. So there's rivalry there. Um, it,
Yes,
right,
there has
very complicated.
I think there's always been rivalry, but a
Yes,
lot of that rivalry was not coming to the surface because the priority threat was Iran, the
right.
immediate threat. And now that that threat has been pushed back, we're going to see what this looks like in sort of a post-Iran region. And it's also going to be an interesting time for the United States because on the one hand, um, the Washington didn't consult with any of these countries about its decision to go to war, and I don't think it was consistently saying, "We think this threat is absolutely imminent and requires war at this moment in time."
Mhm.
But on the other hand, what these countries had been doing by and large was working with Iran, maintaining diplomatic channels to Iran, not rigorously enforcing the sanctions on Iran out of a view that if they kept things calm and open with Iran, they wouldn't be attacked.
Targeted, yes,
And
and now
that's
they
not.
were.
And that is exactly the opposite of what has happened. So,
Yep.
you're one of these countries and you look at who actually supported your defense, it is the United States and Israel.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, okay, complicated world over there. It's gonna require enormous diplomatic talent, something that we have recently shown that we lack. Um, worrisome for sure. It's open for anybody, I guess, to make the case for the future there. But one thing that is in the way of the future there is the enormous humanitarian disaster that that these wars have left. And first and foremost is in Gaza, but southern Lebanon and good chunks of Iran um, are in ruins, and people are suffering. And I mean, leave aside the numbers of people killed; the people who are still living are. This is unconscionable for the world. How do we um, address the humanitarian disaster to begin to restore any moral high ground, but also the kind of trust you need if you're going to build a future?
Well, first of all, I completely agree with you. I think not only is nobody focused on any reconstruction, rehabilitation, or what it takes on the other side of war, but there was no planning for it. Not in
Mm,
Gaza, not in
no,
Lebanon, and certainly not in the Iran case. And we also have societies and countries that are still on the other side of deadly conflict: Syria, Yemen, Iraq. And the United
and
States
Lebanon terrified of another civil war.
absolutely terrified and massive population displacement
Yes.
and a US position right now aligned with Israel that there will be no reconstruction until disarmament of Hezbollah. And a challenge here I think is there's not a real consensus about what disarmament completely is and when we'll know, but I think it's safe to say that that's going to take a long time. And the children of Lebanon, the children of Gaza, shouldn't have to wait years to be in safe spaces, to have access to services, to have access to schools. Parents shouldn't have to wait. The United States, I think, has done itself a tremendous disservice by the dismantling of the U.S. Agency for International Development and most of our programming for things like U.S. assistance, U.S. humanitarian aid. The United States is also not investing in international organizations that could be doing some of this work, like the United Nations. So there's tremendous space here. And then I should also say, we've fired a lot of, in the Trump administration, a lot of the technical experts and assistants experts that actually know how to do this work.
Mhm.
But what we do know from Iraq and Afghanistan is that the military cannot do all of these things, nor should they be asked to. And so we need
Nor
to
will they be trusted. I mean, there's a reason why we have defense, development, and diplomacy, and they're in separate houses. But this crowd has said, "Oh, no, sorry, this is all the military, and our military guys will set up baseball fields," and all of that stuff.
And if you go
It
back in the
Yeah,
history, secretaries of defenses, they all say, if you don't invest in development in these things, I'm going to have to buy more bullets. So generally, you've had secretaries of defense pleading for more emphasis, more funding, and more empowering of the other two Ds, the
yep,
development and diplomacy.
yep.
So I think that there just has to be more light shown on these issues. Frankly, leaders, members of Congress, American civil society, and others need to keep thinking about this not just through a military lens, but through a human lens. That if we do not urgently address these issues, we may have achieved something against Iran's proxies and set back these real threats in the region, but we are about to lose a generation.
What we have are, I mean, a proud administration saying we are the Department of War. We are the most lethal ever. Um, what we need are leaders who are peacemakers and understand what that takes. And that requires us to be tough with our friends and our adversaries alike, and to say that the human life matters and that we cannot do this to people. And it's very hard to measure the gains against these losses and say we are strategically better off and have lost our humanity. And American support for all of this is eroding. It'll be tough to pass a big defense bill. I think it should be tough to pass. It should be impossible to pass $1.5 trillion defense bill. Um, but what you do inside it, whatever the size of it is, those are tough decisions. And they need people like you who gotta get back in there and help them make these decisions, because it is a goddamn clown show. Sorry, that's me. I get to be. Yeah,
Listen, I agree, with the first of all, I think it's very important that Americans are asking tough questions about this war and about where our emphasis is in the dollars that the administration is requesting. And this announcement of the $1.5 trillion defense budget, remember, it's just the first step. Congress really gets a say here.
yes, we do, 'cause
And
zeroing out any help for Ukraine in it is probably also a thing that we should pay attention to.
yes, I will say that when I, was a Senate aide, I remember one very noteworthy member of Congress telling me, "Well, we're gonna do with the president's budget what we do with all presidential budgets, put it in the trash and do what we want to do." And so hopefully there are people on
Once upon a time, we had a legislature that decided that Article 1 of our Constitution was worth something. We'll see if we get back to that.
agree with you. I think it's very important to pay attention to the voices that really are raising concerns about war powers, the president's authority to continue this war in the Middle East. And it is very important that members of Congress advocate for diplomacy and development dollars alongside
Yep,
whatever the
yep,
defense budget debate is.
yep. Well, this is, day 60. This is the day that the War Powers Act says, "You know what? You can't keep going." Um, y It's gonna pass with little notice, right? Because the rule of law is also an issue here. We are weakened along with the people we're fighting. And God knows our government was stronger when it had the talent in it like you. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your wisdom, and, for the service you've given all of us.
Thank you for what you're doing. Pleasure to be with you today.
Bye.